Yeah, there's no questions. We can get on to the topic of tonight, which is, now that we've sort of established our groundwork, which is, we seem to need, right, this, like we said, this uncaused, all-powerful, omniscient, intelligent, willful being to have created everything, right? We've went through 10 arguments, hopefully demonstrating it pretty conclusively. But now we're sort of left with a bit of a conundrum, because we recognize now, okay, this being, again, as Aquinas says, we'll call it God. Okay, this being exists, created everything at sort of the cosmological beginning. But now, okay, so we didn't use the Bible to figure that out. We just kind of looked at reality. But now we're left with, okay, so fine, this God created the universe. Who is this God? And who are we in relation to this God? What is our purpose? What is our purpose towards God, towards each other, towards our life? And now examining physics and math is not going to answer these questions for us, right? So we've kind of hit a limit of what we can figure out by just examining the natural world. And this is sort of the limit that Paul sort of mentioned in Romans 1, where he said, since the beginning, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. But obviously he didn't say, since the beginning, the fact that Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh and he rose from the dead, that's obvious. Like, he didn't say that part, right? He said there's some amount that we can glean about God from examining reality, but only to a point. And so now I brought a prop tonight. Our worldview is kind of like a funnel, right? We're kind of distilling in all this information that we get from, maybe internally or from what people are saying. We're sort of synthesizing all this stuff and it's going in our funnel. But the problem is there's a hole in our funnel, because no matter what we kind of glean from this world or try to figure out, some stuff is going to be leaking out that we can't explain, right? No matter, we'll try to find out what our purpose is and what does it mean, and but we're not going to be able to really fully explain it. We have a hole in our reality. And this hole is basically what we had discovered the very first class when we looked at Gödel's incompleteness theorems, right? So I'll write that again on the board. Because what he said was, there are things that are true that can't be proven, right? And so when it comes to what is true about, again, our nature, the nature of God, the nature of our purpose, our being, we may think we know it, but we can never really be sure, right? Because we are sort of within this system that's incomplete, right? And again, you may remember, crucially, the thing about Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that it wasn't just actually that things are true that can never be proven, but they cannot be proven within the system that we're in, right? We would need someone outside the system to tell us like how things are. And again, I'll use an analogy, right? So again, I'm a video game developer and I make these worlds and games, and if someone were to play my games, they would understand something about me, right? What I enjoy, what I think is fun or interesting. And this actually extends to almost like so many things in life. If you go to a museum and you see a painting, right? You may understand something about it. Okay, this is really interesting or intriguing. Or you hear a moving poem or something. You watch a moving film, a movie. Like you start to piece together what you think maybe the intent was, the meaning was. But you'd have to ask the creator, like, what did you mean by that line in the poem? What did you mean by that scene in the film? Or to me, what did you mean by that part of your game? And just experiencing it is not enough for you to understand the meaning behind it, the purpose, right? You have to ask. And it's also just the same as, and getting to know a person, right? If you're married or have a friend or children, right? There's some things you can understand about them by talking with them and seeing them. But at some point you have to ask them, like, what do you think about this? Do you like this? What is your opinion on that? Like, they have to tell you, right? You only, stalking someone only get you so far to learn what someone is, right? You have to ask them, right? And so again, we have these holes in our reality everywhere. Anywhere we try to understand meaning or understand, who someone is, we have holes in our reality. So, this applies to math and science, but also just applies almost everywhere in our lives, right? There are things that we just cannot know for sure. unless like the person, the being, the creator tells you. And again, I hope you're probably seeing the parallel now with if we want to understand, your spouse, you ask them. If you want to understand a painting, you can ask the painter. If you want to understand our reality, you have to ask the creator of that reality. And this is why we need the Bible, right? So some people might say, okay, fine, they followed us in the class so far. All right, there's a God, I guess. There's some all creator, powerful force. Yeah, but fine, whatever. I'll just, go about my life, who cares? And, this is where we can start to see, I think, the sort of breakdown, as I mentioned, in sort of the skeptic naturalist worldview, right? Because, the idea of like, well, I want to know the truth, right? Like, I love science because I get to know the truth, what are the reasons behind things. And then, but then if you say like, okay, well, if you followed us in the class so far, now we need to understand who this God is. So they should say, you're right, we really should get to the bottom of it, right? But of course, the skeptic doesn't want to get to the bottom of it, right? They want to just be blissfully ignorant, right? So you start to see maybe that this sort of worldview of the sort of skeptic atheist is really coming apart at the seams almost everywhere, because they put reason on a pedestal until it sort of undermines their own worldview, and then they sort of just brush off to the side, right? So yes, it really is essential that we require some divine revelation in order to understand our reality. If we're not content with just being like, yeah, I don't know, I guess the universe was made, I don't care, I'm going to go about my day. But if you do care, like, okay, we've all said now for the last two classes, there is a God. Who is he? Who is this God? Right? If you want to get to the bottom of it, we need divine revelation. That's the only thing that can fill in this incomplete understanding of our reality. And so this is why we need, the Bible, or at least, some book, some revelation from outside the system. We're going to, in a later class, look at all the other world religions and see why, in my opinion, Christianity is sort of the only coherent one. But suffice to say, we require some, again, instruction from outside our system. I think I mentioned in the first class the movie The Matrix, right? Again, Neo had to go outside the Matrix to understand the rules of the system. When he was in the system, he couldn't understand he had this idea of like what might be true. He couldn't understand it. It was only outside the system. So we require some being outside our reality to tell us how things are. We cannot come to understand it ourselves. Any questions about that right off the top? Oh, good. So let's take a look at an example of how this can go wrong if we decide, no, we can do it ourselves. We don't need God to tell us how things are. So there's a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, and one thing he was not a Christian, although he had some pretty interesting ideas about God and things like that. But one thing he was trying to arrive at was an explanation for absolute morality that didn't involve God. So you remember one of our proofs for the arguments for the existence of God was the argument from morality. So he had an argument that didn't involve God, and it went like this. So this was what we call a proof by contradiction. So what that means is you assume something that you want to show is false. You assume it's true. You show how that leads to a contradiction, and then you say, well, look, the thing I assumed to be true must be false then, okay? So this is a very common thing in mathematics and philosophy and logic, right? So his assumption is, it is okay for me to steal. Okay, so this is what he wants to show, it's not okay to steal. Okay, this is his goal, because he wants to arrive at a system of absolute morality. So say, okay, let's assume it's okay for me to steal. And then he said, I'm going to leave some room because I'm going to add some logical notation here, but he said, well, okay, if it's okay for me to steal, then we can universalize this truth, he said. So we can conclude it's okay for anyone to steal, right? And this may make some degree of sense, unless we consider ourselves to have like the divine right of kings. We probably think that the rules that apply to us apply to everyone. Okay, for everyone to steal. But he said, well, hold on now. We all know it's so obvious that it's not okay for everyone to steal. Right? We all know this. Not okay for everyone. Again, everyone to steal. And so this is a contradiction. So we conclude our first premise was actually false. So conclusion, it is not okay for me to steal. Okay? For me to steal. Okay. Now, first of all, I've mentioned a couple times how we can break something down into propositional logic and see what someone's really saying, okay? So what this is basically saying, it's okay for me to steal. What he's saying is, there exists an x such that it's not okay, s of x. Okay, now this is a lot of symbolic logic here. Let me explain how this all works. Okay, this means, I'll write down here. In logic, the backwards e means there exists. Okay, there exists. We know that this is not, we remember that, right? This is a symbol for not in logic. Oh, yeah. Okay, good. So go to the backwards e. That one come up for you? No, that one doesn't come up. Okay. And then this, I mean, again, like this, the particular variables or the letters we choose don't really matter. Like in the past, I did, I think U for universe. It doesn't really matter, but you can define what it means. So we're defining, the function s of x to mean x can steal. Okay. So we're saying, it is okay for me to steal. Sorry, by the backwards. There exists an x such that s of x. There exists a person such that they can steal, and that person is me, because he said it is okay for me to steal. Okay, so there exists at least one person. He says, okay, well then it's the case that it's for all x, s of x. So the logic loves upside down and backwards things. So the upside down a means all. Okay, so he's saying, okay, there exists a person who can steal, namely me. Therefore, it's okay for everyone to steal. But we know it's not okay for everyone to steal. I guess I kind of ran it. I didn't run out of room here. We'll put it over here. For all x, not okay to steal. And sure enough, that is a contradiction here. But now, first of all, we can see that there's actually a lot of problems with this idea, even though, without the logic notation, it kind of seems reasonable. Okay, we assume it's okay for me to steal. Then I guess, sure, it makes sense that it's okay for everyone to steal. But yeah, I guess we do know it's not okay for everyone to steal. So we conclude it's not okay for me to steal. Okay, it does make some degree of intuitive sense, but let's break it down. First of all, to go from here to here is actually a violation of logic. Okay, let's see why that would be. Let's say we say there exists a pizza's x, that's a Hawaiian pizza. Okay, that's true. There is such a pizza, right? Then we say, therefore, all pizza is Hawaiian pizza. Exactly. Well, in an ideal world, not this side of heaven, I guess. But we see, right? That can't be true, right? It doesn't work that way. It does work the other way, though. If all pizza was Hawaiian pizza, then sure, there exists a pizza that's Hawaiian, because they all do, right? Do you see? You can go this way in logic. You cannot go this way, right? So hopefully that makes sense. So right off the bat, Immanuel Kant has broken a rule of logic, okay? But then we say, well, okay, come on, fine. It's not like a rigorous logic, but it makes intuitive sense, right? Let's think about that. It's okay, or this one, sorry. It is not okay for everyone to steal, he concluded down here. But why would that be? I mean, let's think about it. Is that even true in our world? I mean, well, no, right? Like sometimes, the government or government agents steal things. I mean, a very classic example, like the Allied code breakers stole secrets from the Nazis to turn the tide of World War II. Was that wrong? Well, probably not, right? So obviously then there are exceptions, right? And so if there are exceptions, then this is not a universal truth. This is just like, well, on a case-by-case basis, usually it'll be so, but that is not absolute morality then. That's just how our society is structured. And when it's convenient and when it's not, we'll figure it out, we'll judge it, that's just called a societal norm, or maybe a law or a custom. Like, we have names for these already, and absolute morality is not what we call these things, right? But we can even think of it beyond that. Again, I mentioned the idea of like a video game, okay? I don't know if you're familiar with a video game called Grand Theft Auto, but a big part of the game, perhaps you'll glean from the name, is stealing cars. Okay, so you steal. I mean, other things in that game too, but theft is one of them. Now, what if somehow all the characters, you're playing the game, and the character came up to you and said, we all collectively somehow have decided that it's not okay to steal. We've come to understand this. It's not okay for everyone to steal. You or the creator of the game would say, you're wrong. Because the creator could say, I made you, and I made this world, and it is okay. And I'm telling you it's okay. That's how I made it. So you all, I don't really care what you collectively came to understand. You're wrong, right? So we can understand it from this angle too, which is, it doesn't matter, even if everyone thinks it. They didn't make the world, so they don't get to decide if it's right or wrong. They can decide we don't like it, it's not our norm, we're choosing not to do it, right? But again, this is not what absolute morality is, right? This is just a custom, a norm, a law. And so for all of these reasons, this is just not something we can ever conclude, right? This is not how our society works in any fashion. It's not how any construction of any society, or let's say game or anything like that, would ever work. And so this idea that we could just conclude something so bold is just not reflective of anything in our reality, right? And I just don't think anyone could honestly say this unless they were really kind of deluding themselves for the purpose of trying to, arrive at absolute morality without God, right? Like whether you're breaking rules of logic, you're kind of deluding yourself about how your own society works, or any society, it just breaks down all over the place. And I think, even though if we didn't really dive in, it kind of makes some degree of sense. We kind of get it. But if you really break it down, you'll again see that when we try to arrive at these absolute ideas without God, we're going to run into trouble every time. Because fundamentally, the whole notion of absolute, right, of this, eternal, timeless standard. I mean, the only way that makes sense is to sort of have this eternal standard by which you're measuring against, which again, as Aquinas was wont to say, this thing we call God. Like, it just comes back to it time and time and time again. So there's just no way to get to absolute morality without God. But this is the kind of thing you'll kind of see, right? Is that someone will kind of just blast you with like these kind of phrases, and they'll say it quickly enough and boldly enough that you might be like, oh, they said it very confidently. Maybe they're right, But if you go very slow and break it down, you'll see that like typically rules of logic will be broken, assumptions will be made like just stated outright that just are not defendable. Any questions about that? Good. Okay, we're gonna do one more example to kind of show how this sort of worldview and this sort of faulty logic breaks down a lot. So again, if someone were following along the class thus far, they may say, okay, fine, yeah, maybe God exists, I don't know, but I don't believe the Bible. The Bible's wrong, and because the Bible's wrong, there is no God. I don't believe in God. And actually, this comes up a lot. Again, I've watched a lot of sort of what they call deconstruction videos on YouTube, where people are like, well, I used to be a Christian and now I'm not. And a lot of them will say something like, well, I was, and it usually go like this, and you can see a red flag right from the start. They'll say, okay, I was a Christian my whole life. I led like the worship team at my church, whatever, And then one day I decided, you know what, maybe I should read the Bible. Okay, they're like 30, 40 years, and maybe I'll read the Bible. Which I guess, that's a little bit curious. I don't know, you've gone this 30, 40 years, Christian your whole life, never read the Bible. And then they're like, and you know what, I found out there was slavery in there. Did you know that? They'll say to like, whoever the co-host on their little YouTube thing, did you know that? There's slavery in the Bible. Wow, really? Yeah, I couldn't be a Christian anymore. I found out there's slavery in the Bible. And so I'm not a Christian anymore, he says, okay? I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist now. And like, that was almost verbatim with like what you can find on YouTube, like even a quick search will find exactly that. And what they've basically done is they found something in the Bible they don't like. And so they said, because the Bible is, again, works well. Let me try this other one. There we go. Okay. Because the Bible is wrong. Okay, so not again, right? So the Bible is false. Therefore, there's no God. That's basically what they conclude, right? I found out there's slavery in the Bible. I found out that God ordered, the destruction of the Canaanites. Whatever. I found out God, like someone said to me, I used to work with a guy who said he didn't believe in God, and he was a vegan. And I said, well, or I think he was like, well, why do you eat meat or something? I said, well, the Bible says I can eat meat, And then I showed him the passage. He's like, well, if that's what the Bible says, I don't believe the Bible then, right? And then therefore I don't believe in God. Okay. And so like, again, this is not a made up thing. Like this is what people say, pretty often. But now, if you remember our rules of logic, this is equivalent to flipping this and changing the knots, right? So this is logically equivalent to if God exists, then the Bible is true. But now this is a little bit weird, right? Because if God exists and the Bible is true, well, what if like the God of Hinduism is true, exists? Then the Bible is also true? Well, that can't be, right? What if, the God of Sikhism is true? Then the Bible's still true? Well, that can't be, right? This is so that we see like this is just wrong. This can't be right. But if this is wrong, well, then this one, which is logically equivalent, it's saying the exact same thing. Well, then this can't be right. So why are people using this to claim that they don't believe in God? And what they've done is, again, they've made an error in logic. Because this is incorrect. Correct way would go like this. If the Bible is true, then there's a God. Well, that's obvious because the Bible says there's a God. So if the Bible is true, there has to be a God. That's pretty obvious. And now, of course, again, if we do our little flip, switcheroo, add the knots, if God doesn't exist, well, then the Bible's false. Well, sure. Oh, that's obvious. No problem there. If God doesn't exist, then of course the Bible's false. But do you see, this is actually very different from this. And what they've done is actually something a very common error in logic. They've seen this. Okay, so and even atheists will agree, right? If the Bible is true, then God exists. This is not a controversial statement. What they've done is they've just put a knot in front of this, right, to get to here. But you can't do that. That is not valid logic. But you'll see this kind of thing all the time. So they've made an error in logic and concluded that, well, because I don't believe in God, then, because I don't believe the Bible, then I'm an atheist, right? They never say, or very, very, almost never, right? They'll say, yeah, okay, I found out there was slavery in the Bible. So I said, oh my goodness gracious, I can't be a Christian anymore. And therefore I went to the next book and I looked at the Quran. And now I'm a Muslim, right? You don't see those videos on YouTube, right? Those are not there. Well, why? Because the point is not that they found something troubling in the Bible and didn't believe in God. The problem is they no longer believe in God and therefore just concluded the Bible was false, right? So really it's gone that way. But they're looking for a scapegoat, right? So they want to defend their decisions. They say, well, I found this problem in the Bible and it led me to not believe in God. But again, this is just actually erroneous logic, right? And we can see it very clearly, again, when we write it out, sort of apply this, valid transformations in logic, we come to something that we see just cannot be, okay? So again, someone may just say to you, well, sure, the Bible has slavery and death and this and that, whatever, whatever they complain about, and therefore I don't believe in God. And you might again think, wow, I guess like that's a troublesome thing. I don't know, what am I going to do with that? But again, if you lay it out, it's not really saying anything. And again, right, we kind of talked about this in this idea of like, what are the cosmological implications? Okay, so the Bible has slavery. I mean, the Bible could have, the Bible does have some difficult passages. Yeah, that's true. But it could have way more than that and still not have cosmological implications, right? God could come down in person in the Old Testament and just be obliterating people left and right, tricking people, stealing, anything. Like you could imagine the worst possible story. But it still wouldn't mean God doesn't exist, right? It might mean that God is mean or cruel, maybe. But there's nothing that the Bible could ever say to prove that God doesn't exist. Right? Even if, for example, it said, the earth is flat, right? Even if it said something like that, you still couldn't conclude because maybe God is tricking us. And that's just who he is, right? I mentioned the idea of like Loki, the Norse god of trickery. Maybe that's God. But you see, it doesn't matter what the Bible says. We already had 2 classes, 10 arguments that we didn't talk about the Bible. and concluded that we needed God to exist to explain reality. So literally, the Bible could say anything, and we could never conclude that that was justification for not believing in God. Justification maybe, like I said, for, well, I don't want to be a Christian then. Maybe. But again, that's just not what you see people say, right? I've never once seen a YouTube video of someone saying, yeah, I couldn't believe in the Bible anymore, and that's why now I'm, again, I'm Sikh or I'm Muslim. Like, it just never happens. It always is just a way for them to just subvert their kind of idea, just conclude they don't want to believe in God at all. Any questions about that one?
I wish that I'd be able to explain that now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Aha. Okay. Right. So, yeah, very good question. So, in fact, I've had someone say to that. My very good friend, let me turn my phone off. I don't know if you guys can hear. I keep hearing beeping up here the whole time. My very good friend, I was kind of talking with him, and we were, kind of going into it, and I was kind of, getting him into a corner logically, as it were. And at the end, he said, "Well, fine. Maybe God does exist, but I would never worship that God. That God is evil. Maybe on my deathbed, I would like begrudgingly say, fine, I guess I'll go to heaven, but I would never worship this God," right? And like, to some degree, like, I can understand, right? Because I just had a whole thing about, maybe God is evil and he'd still be God. But think about this. What is the definition of good? Well, I mean, the only real definition would be good is just how close you are to the nature of God, right? That's the only, like, I don't know how else you could ever define it. Like, that's the only definition that makes sense, right? It's just how close you are to the nature of the creator of the reality. I don't know how else you define it. And so if that's what good means, then if God is going around murder and mayhem, that's, like, by definition good. And if we think it's bad, we're just wrong, right? If God says slavery is good and we think it's not, we're just wrong then, right? Again, like, can you imagine playing a sport? You're playing soccer and you slap the ball with the hands, and the ref is like, tweet, penalty, and you're like, what are you talking about? Who gave you the right to tell me what the rules are? I mean, like, but that's kind of the same thing, right? God has, created the universe, created morality, created consciousness and will, and yet we're saying, whoa, God, but you're wrong about, how you set up reality. I mean, this is crazy, right? I mean, it's arrogant and just nonsensical to just say, sure, God, yeah, you made reality, you made, morality and the universe and everything, existence, but I'm right on this one. I have figured out what reality is. You've got it wrong, right? So to anyone who thinks that, I think, like, they just don't have a logical foundation, right? Because they're basically saying that they know better than God. And I think they're just confused about what goodness even means, or what it even means to be correct, or what truth and falsehood even mean, right? Like, I just don't know how you can logically claim it. Now, in some sense, it's a little bit unpalatable, but I think actually this really gets to the heart of sin, right? So now I guess we're, maybe take a little bit of a detour from sort of cosmology and logic, but I mean, is this not what sin is, right? Even in Genesis, right? Sin is us saying we know better than God, right? So that's the crux of it. So whether it's like, well, God appears evil and I know better, or just like, well, I have figured out how I want to live my life, whatever it is, it's still kind of the same thing of us saying we know what's right. God, I think you're wrong. I'm going to do it my way, right? And so to someone who concludes, well, I don't want to worship, I don't want anything to do with that God, I think that's how sin is. I mean, and I think they just don't have a logical foundation. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Right. Okay. So one thing I was gonna say about that too, right, is again thinking about. I have the example on the board of Kant's, absolute morality. We all know it's so obvious. We know that we can't steal, but again, like, what does it mean that would be obvious? Because there are some things that we think are obvious now that weren't obvious 100 years ago. So, for example, is it okay for someone to be in a homosexual relationship? Well, according to today's society, it's so obvious that's true. So obvious. How can you ever think otherwise, right? according to society. But 100 years ago, that wasn't very obvious. In fact, you would be put in jail. And basically the whole world thought it was not okay. Well, okay, so if morality is really obvious, I guess then we know what's right, and everyone else in the past was just fools. But no, wait a minute. Is there anything that we think maybe is immoral that 100 years from now they'll think, man, those guys back in 2022 they were such fools. How could they not see? Here in 21, 22, we know it's so obvious. Blah blah blah, whatever it is. So, and I'm sure there will be such things, right? That's how history works, right? People change, society changes. So what's obvious now was very much not obvious 100 years ago. What's going to be obvious to society in 100 years is definitely not obvious now. So I just don't know how you could ever claim, well, it's so obvious. Morality is so obvious we just can't steal, right? Again, this sort of C.S. Lewis called this like chronological snobbery, that now in our time, we're so enlightened. Everyone in the past, they were all fools and barbarians, and I guess in the future, they will be wrong too, right? So now they're going to be making all kinds of mistakes in the future. But now we know, right? And also, by the way, if any culture disagrees with us in the present time, they're also wrong. Sorry. So really, what is this person saying? It's again kind of like the whole thing about God, that God is evil. They're saying anyone who disagrees with my obvious morality is wrong, right? So they're basically saying like that the entire morality of the universe is vested in me, one person at this moment in time, and I know what's right. Everyone else who disagrees with me is wrong. Everyone in the past is wrong. Everyone in the future is wrong, and I know it's right. And that's basically what the argument of like, well, it's so obvious, that it's wrong. Everyone can't steal. It's so obvious. I mean, now a lot of people would have agreed stealing is wrong throughout history, but the point is you can pick many other examples, like I mentioned, and have it be very non-obvious. And so again, right, whenever someone tries to plug that hole in reality by somehow just appealing to, well, it's obvious, and I know, or it's so obvious that slavery is wrong, God said it was right, therefore God is, I'm not going to worship that God. Or God says homosexuality is wrong. Okay, well then God is crazy and a fool, whatever, and I know what's right. Again, all these appeals are not only just logically doomed, but really I think are going to be like, we sort of see historical evidence, like you're in a really bad footing because many people have sort of made, you can pick anything, it doesn't even matter, right? But people have all kinds of opinions that seem foolish to almost every other time and culture, and only really make sense in your little bubble, right? So yeah, whether you're talking about morality or truth, pretty much any time you're going to run up against this idea that I think the speaker doesn't really understand what they're saying, which is they're basically, when you get down to it, saying that I know all truth, and anyone who disagrees with me is wrong, right? Which of course they would never admit to saying, but when you kind of break it down, like that's the only logical conclusion. Okay, time we got here. Okay, we're doing pretty well. Any questions about any of that? All good so far. Okay. Check my notes here. Okay. Okay. Oh, right. Yes. Now, again, right, like we can see too that this is not just a Christian idea. I had mentioned in the first class the evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein, who's not a Christian, but saying that at bottom we need to have some faith that we even exist, right? And again, we can start to see, I think, I've kind of mentioned the skeptic atheist worldview is really sort of self-contradictory in a lot of ways, because again, right at the outset, probably, like I mentioned in the first class, they'll say like, well, my position is a very reasonable one because I don't believe in God, and your position is very, irrational because you believe in God, you're a Christian, right? And so we've shown, again, through many arguments, that doesn't make any sense. Again, through atheist scientists as well, that you need to have some amount of faith. And again, like we sort of went over, anytime you kind of probe and say like, well, let's dive into that a little bit, like, what do you mean by, we can find absolute morality without God? Let's see what this really is saying. Or what do you mean it's so obvious that there's, this kind of thing is true or that kind of thing is true, you start to find some really big problems. And what you'll find is that their answers now will really be far from the reason and logic that they sort of proposed at the start, right? That, well, I'm an atheist and that means I'm so rational, right? But then again, now you start to ask them these sort of questions about reality and, and now it starts getting into some weird territory. Like we said, well, it's just so obvious. It's just so obvious. Well, what was the rational underpinnings of that? Oh, it's just obvious? Okay, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And a couple of things too. People have said that, so for example, Christians are very intolerant because we say, well, in the Bible, Jesus says he's the only way to God, But this is like a very weird thing too, because think of it this way. If a Christian says, well, okay, Jesus is the only way to God, and someone says, well, no, you can't say that. That's intolerant. You're wrong. Well, so then you're saying, so you're intolerant of my belief, right? Like you're saying like, if they tolerate your belief, then they should allow you to have the belief that everyone else is wrong but you, right? Because to say that you can't hold that belief is also intolerant, right? And again, why is that? Well, again, any of these appeals to some absolute standard are going to fail, right? So, you must accept everyone's belief, right? Otherwise is intolerant. Again, this absolute standard, you must accept everyone's belief. Well, then you have to accept the belief that someone believes the exact opposite of you, and that's acceptable, right? But again, essentially, it's sort of self-contradictory, right? Because you're saying that their belief that's opposite to yours is also equally valid. Well, that's logically incongruent because they both can't be true then, right? So that's sort of nonsense. Let's see here. What else we got here? I had something I was going to say. Now I forgot what it was. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. I'm going to cut this out of the video. Let's see here. Okay. Well, maybe I'll talk a little bit about then. So we've said, okay, we need some source of divine revelation. We can't just, piece together an understanding of reality based on what we can see, because we need some information from outside the system. And so we as Christians would propose, well, we have such a thing. We have this Bible that God told us from outside the system of how things are. So why don't we take a little bit of time and think about why we can trust it, right? Because that's an important aspect of showing why, again, for anyone who is legitimately seeking, and they followed us this far, they say, yes, you're right, there's a God, yes, you're right, I require some divine revelation. But, I don't know, this other, the Quran looks pretty good. The Buddhist text looks pretty good. Why should I trust the Bible, right? I was actually just, so every once in a while, Mormons contact me and they say, hey, can we talk to you? And I say, yeah, let's talk. And so they love to say that the Bible is corrupted. You can't trust it, even though they say they also believe it, right? Which is a really weird thing. So, and, for example, there's a, I don't have it offhand, but there's a verse in Isaiah where, and God is saying, before me, there were no other gods formed, and after me, no other gods will be formed. And of course, if you know the Mormon theology, they don't believe that's true, right? They believe that there's essentially an infinite number of gods. We'll all become gods. I mean, if you believe Mormonism, right? If you don't, then you go to hell, of course. But if you a good Mormon, you'll become a god, and then you'll spawn a universe, and there'll be more gods, okay? And I asked them, I said, well, how do you explain this verse from Isaiah? And they literally said to me, if I believe your interpretation, I would have to believe the Bible's true, but that would destroy my worldview, so I don't believe it, right? Which, I mean, says a lot, I think, right? They basically said exactly the problem. They don't believe the Bible, right? Now, oddly, I say they believe the Bible is corrupted. That's why they don't believe it, but they also claim to hold it, in very high esteem, which of course is sort of contradictory. But Let's think about this a little bit. So, we're looking at a bunch of arguments that were very rigorous and scientific and mathematical. We cannot use that kind of thinking to demonstrate the reliability of the Bible, right? Because the Bible is not a math equation, okay? But we have some things that can give us some very good evidence. So when historians look at any ancient document, there's criteria they use, okay? And one, I'll say, okay, so like, I'll put historical criteria, okay? Well, okay, for reliability of ancient documents, there we go. Reliability of ancient documents, okay? Because obviously, the study of ancient documents is much different from the study of anything modern, where we have, every person's meal documented on Facebook or whatever, right? But obviously, they didn't have that back then. So they use different criteria. Number one, the accuracy compared to other ancient manuscripts. Or actually, I'll put accuracy amongst the manuscripts. Actually, amongst the manuscripts. All right. Amongst manuscripts. So what I mean by this is, if you look at all the kind of records you have of the Bible or any ancient document, how much are they saying the same thing? How much do they contradict each other? How much are they saying different things? Okay. And so we can use a bit of an example. So we're going to analyze. We're going to compare the Bible and the records of Alexander the Great, okay, the Greek emperor. Presumably we all believe he's a historical figure. I mean, unreal, right? I don't think we deny that. However, what we're going to see is actually we believe that based on some pretty shaky evidence, but we still think, yeah, it's probably true. Okay, so let's look into it. So I'll do A for Alexander the Great and B for Bible. The manuscript agreement amongst everything for Alexander the Great is only about 66%, which means for any given event described about his life, where he went, what he did, you only get about 2/3 of the manuscript actually saying that same thing. The other third diverge. And now maybe some of this is just lack of our understanding, right? So they say, he went, like for now, we might say, well, okay, what building are we in? Are we in Maple Ridge Baptist Church or Ridge Church? Well, it's the same, right? We know it's the same. But someone, 1,000 years from now, they may not understand that. So if someone is recording this night, they may have two different documents say a different thing. And it seems different. So now we'll give them a bit of benefit out. Maybe it's actually higher. We just lack historical understanding to see where things actually are just saying the same thing, okay? But nevertheless, for the Bible, the accuracy is like just astronomically high. Like I don't know what it is. I'm just putting a bunch of names, but like it's like ludicrously high. The differences between all the ancient documents is like, they missed a comma. Like it's so accurate that it actually defies reason. It doesn't make sense unless you believe it's like divinely inspired. It doesn't make sense because it's unlike every other ancient document. Nothing is like that. Nothing has that much agreement. Okay. Now, to be clear, just because the documents say the same thing doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? And that's kind of what I meant at the start of this. Like, this isn't a mathematical argument for why it's true. A high number here doesn't mean it's true necessarily, but historians use it to see, like, well, is it reliable? Another way to look at it would be, do we understand what the Bible is claiming, right? Because if we don't understand what it's even claiming, we can't analyze if it's true. So first we have to say, do we even agree on what it's saying to us, right? So again, like the Mormons, right? They don't agree with us what the Bible's even saying. Okay, well now we have a bit of a problem now, because how do we even have a discussion, right? So first, this is what this is saying. Is it reliable in the sense of like, do we even understand what it's saying, right? So did Alexander the Great go here or here? Do we have any agreement about what he actually did, or what the documents are even saying he did? Truthfulness is sort of another issue. First, you have to decide, do we even understand what it's saying to us? And I think for the Bible, we do have a good understanding of what it's saying to us, because the the manuscripts and the documents are all so accurate amongst each other. And remember, this is before the printing press. This is all hand copied, right? Or hand transcribed, which again is the same for all ancient documents. So the fact the Bible is so accurate really, again, defies reason. Okay. Another one is, oh, right. So the volume of manuscripts or documents, copies, whatever you want to call it, manuscripts / copies. Okay. Again, so Alexander the Great. So here, yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Alexander the Great has 3. Now, again, to have 3 documents, 3 manuscripts, 3 copies is pretty amazing, because there's actually a lot of ancient documents that are referred to that we don't have any copies of. Even, for example, some of Paul's letters in the Bible, we have no copies of those, right? It'd be nice to even have 1. Like, to have 3 would be unbelievable, right? So the fact there's 3 is actually really good for an ancient document. Now, how many does the Bible have? Well, about 25,000. Okay. Now it breaks down like this. Let's see here. What do we got? Okay, 5,000. Or sorry, 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek manuscripts. Complete or, and actually, while on the subject, I will say that interestingly, this number is actually growing, believe it or not. The reason, it's not growing very fast, but the reason being, people are still finding manuscripts in libraries. They just don't know they're there, right? There's like these big libraries, and sometimes they'll have like a manuscript, like that's like stuck in between the pages of a book, or it's like just crammed somewhere. So, but they're actually still finding manuscripts. And again, they still have the high accuracy, right? So again, it's not climbing by a lot, but it is still actually a growing number. Okay, 10,000 Latin manuscripts. 9,300 sort of other languages. This would be like Syriac, Coptic, etc. Okay, oops, etc. Yeah. So again, the volume of copies again really defies reason, because for one of the greatest emperors ever to have existed, we've got 3, and for the Bible we have 25,000. Again, all before the printed press. So again, this is just boggles the mind. It doesn't really make any sense. And one interesting thing I will say, I maybe could have mentioned it earlier, I'll kind of just link it to this one. We have an interesting example of why this is true with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Because now, before Dead Sea Scrolls were found, there was a common suggestion the Bible had been corrupted over time, right? And then, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, which had been preserved in a cave for thousands of years, right? This is obviously the Old Testament scrolls, because it predated even Jesus arriving on Earth, and they were found in what, the 1900s, something, right? So like for 2,000 years they sat in a cave, and then they found these scrolls, and skeptics thought, aha, this is it, we've got it. We're going to show that the Bible has been corrupted and it's over. And in fact, they showed, oh, nope, it's actually the same. It's the same as what we have. So again, right, if it was true, if the Mormon claim, and also, by the way, the Muslim claim, that the Bible had been corrupted, we would see it. We would see the corruption over time. We have manuscripts dating from, I mean, we don't have the original, like actual piece of paper that I don't know, John wrote on, okay, assuming he wrote it. I mean, I guess there's some debate, but we get the point. We don't have that one, but we have, copies from shortly thereafter, okay, but at least from, like the 1st century, second at the very, earliest or latest. And of course, we have copies from that point all the way till now. So if it was the case that the Bible had been corrupted, we would see evidence of it over the years, right? Oh, we can see, the year 300 AD, here's where this mistake happened. And then you can see that, oh, that kind of splintered, and now all these mistakes over here, and they diverged, and this one diverged over here. We would see it. And we don't have anything like that. Nothing. And then you got the Dead Sea Scrolls, which again show that our Old Testament is the same as it was then 2,000 years ago, okay? So there really is just no evidence to the claim that the Bible's been corrupted, because if there were, we would see it. Now, interestingly, just for the sake of comparison, let's see if there's any examples from, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, maybe. The Muslim claims the Bible's been corrupted. Let's think about the Quran for a second here. Did you know there was a point there is something very similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Sana manuscripts. And if I remember correctly, these were found in like an attic in Ethiopia or something. And the researchers you can go look it up. This is somewhat public knowledge, except for the fact that researchers basically don't talk about what they're researching because they're afraid they're going to be murdered. Because what they're finding is a lot of very interesting contradictions to the Quran. And so again, like, it's not secret, but they just don't like talking about it because they're afraid for their lives. Again, you can go look it up. This is public knowledge. Additionally, sort of at the height of kind of the Islamic Empire, there was a bit of a problem. And the problem was that all the different, you can imagine it stretched across, the Middle East and parts of Asia, Africa. There's a problem because at different sort of parts of this empire, people had different views about the Islamic faith and who Muhammad was and what they're meant to do. And part of this was possibly brought on by the fact that there's a story, not in the Quran, but in the hadiths, right? The sayings of Muhammad, where people had this big disagreement about what was right and what was wrong. And so they went to Muhammad and said, okay, this is how I interpret the Quran. And then Muhammad said, yes, you're right. The next guy came and said, this is how I interpret it. Muhammad said, yes, you're right. And the next guy came and said, this is how I interpret it. He said, yes, you're right. And then Muhammad's followers said, like, what you just said everyone was right. They're all in contradiction. And he said, yeah, but it wasn't about the serious things. Like, let's not put a burden on them, right? To believe something, right? And like, again, this kind of rings true. Like, we kind of believe that as Christians too, right? Like the non-essentials, kind of whatever, right? Like we see this, in the book of Acts when they're talking about like, well, what should the Gentiles believe, right? Well, they don't need to believe all the, the Jewish laws, okay? But at a certain point now, hundreds of years later, this sort of became a big problem for the Islamic Empire because it was hard to have sort of this empire cohesion when different parts of the empire believed something very strongly. They had this conflict. So what they did is said, all right, that's it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to make one Quran. We're going to make 5 copies. Every other piece of paper that has anything about the Quran is to be burnt. And they did it. They burned everything in the whole Islamic Empire. They sent one copy to like each sort of main area of the empire, and that was it. Like, this is it. Anything you have, it's gone. That's kind of weird, right? If you've ever watched any movie where, like, the FBI is raiding an office and they're burning everything, you don't be like, yeah, that's on the up and up. Like, I got something to hide. I don't know, right? When did that happen? I'll make a note to look that up for you. Is that the sort of, the height of the Islamic Empire when they're sort of consolidating their power? I'll make a note. I will find that out for you. As we discovered in the class, I'm not so good with dates, apparently. I made that mistake a couple times already. Okay. Where was I? Yeah, sure. Okay. Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. A little out of room here, so I'm going to erase this. Is it okay if I erase this? Anyone still writing down? All good? Okay. All right. Oh, I guess I can keep that. Get rid of my heading.
Basically, they found these Sana manuscripts.
Yeah.
And go, whoopsie. These didn't get burned when there was the great.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then they had something that said.
Yeah, and like, yeah, and here's the thing, right? Like, I don't really like the idea of like, well, let's just pick one thing and be like, that's our gotcha. As we're going to see when we look at the comparative religions, we're going to actually look at the very core beliefs of all the religions and see if they kind of how they match reality. Because it's really annoying, I find, when someone of another faith looks at the Bible and says, well, look at this tiny little thing. That's a contradiction or whatever. Therefore, the whole Bible's bunk. And you're like, come on, like this is this tiny thing. You're not understanding it. There's a context. Like, can you pick something more foundational than this like tiny little thing? So I don't want to do that. And so when I say the sound of management stuff, like this isn't necessarily meant to be like, again, like the silver bullet. But if, again, it's sort of like, again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If they're saying the Bible's corrupted and have no evidence, well, I submit this. What do you say about that, So something to think about. But again, I'm not trying to say like, therefore the whole thing is wrong. Just, it's curious, very curious. Okay. So number one, number two, number three is the time difference. Between the events and the writing of them. The events and when they were written down. Between the events and when they were written down. Now, for our good friend Alexander the Great, this was a few centuries. Which again, in terms of ancient documents, is still pretty good. Like, I didn't choose Alexander the Great because this is a bad example of a historical document. This is actually a pretty good one, right? This is why we all believe Alexander the Great existed, right? There's no, sort of conflict there, a big debate over his existence. We all kind of get it. But even so, there's still a few centuries before it was written down. What about the Bible? How long was the gap between when the events happened of Jesus' life and when they're written down? Well, this is a bit controversial, but I'm going to say a few decades. Now, certain people will dispute this, and they'll say like, no, the Bible wasn't written until like 300 AD, things like that, okay? But I think there's compelling evidence as to why that's not true, and let me explain why that is the case. Okay. So let's think about this. So Jesus, born 0, roughly, right? Died 30, 33, kind of thing, AD, okay? So if, the common contention would be that, yes, the Bible was not written until centuries later, okay? And yet we have a couple interesting examples. So the Great Fire in Rome, how can I note this? I don't know. I know, right? So I don't know, but I don't know. Things to ponder. I don't know. Okay. So, okay, if I have my dates right, again, as we all know, I'm not great at dates, but the Great Fire in Rome, 64 AD, if I'm not mistaken. This is like, so Rome like burns to the ground. Famously, Emperor Nero is said to be like, playing the fiddle while Rome burned. Okay, this kind of thing. So my understanding is that in 64 AD, in 68 AD, though, he wrote, so he blamed it on the Christians, right? And so, essentially, he wrote like, Christians caused the fire, okay? The Christians, caused the fire. He wrote in 68 AD, Christians caused the fire. Now think about this for a second. So Jesus died 30 years prior. The Bible, according to skeptics, has not been written yet. And yet there are so many Christians in Rome, in one city, in Rome, to have them be a scapegoat for a massive fire? That's a little weird. How are there so many? There's no Bible yet for another 200 years. They seem to have kind of grown pretty fast without having any written words to, spread this church. It's kind of weird. In 116 AD, this is jumping ahead 50 years, 116 AD, the Roman scholar Tacitus, so not a Christian, but he's a very famous Roman scholar. Tacitus wrote, Christianity is rampant in Rome. rampant. So again, according to the skeptic, the Bible is still 200 years from being written, and Christianity is rampant in Rome. I don't know, it's a little hard to believe that it could spread that fast with no written words, right? No one has, penned down the words of Jesus, but somehow it's rampant. There is also, I don't have it written down here. I should have written the date. There was a graffiti found in Rome, and they dated it to like around, I think it's between these sometime. And the graffiti was mocking Jesus. They depicted him like on the cross, and his disciples, they drew them as like donkeys or something, like showing that they're like fools for worshiping this God on the cross. Okay. So again, right? It's just common enough in Rome for them to be making graffiti on the walls, mocking Christians. So they're everywhere, and yet the Bible has still not been written for 200 years. I don't know, right? Like, again, is this proof of anything? Like, not really, but it kind of calls into question the objection, I would think. Let's keep going. Actually, let's see if I have enough here. Okay, yeah, probably enough room. Number 3. Okay, James, the brother of Jesus, died in 62 AD. Jesus died in 62 AD, recorded by Josephus, who is a prominent Jewish scholar. So again, right, no reason to lie, right? He's not a Christian. Josephus. Okay, died in 62 AD, so it was a couple years before the Great Fire of Rome, 30 so years after Jesus died. He was one of the leaders, right, of the church, especially in Jerusalem. There's no mention of him dying, though. The Bible does not mention him dying. Only Josephus does. That's a little weird, right? The book Acts of the Apostles talks about him and the church in Jerusalem and all the things they're doing, and yet has no mention that he died. Well, could it be because it was written before he died? That would make sense to me. And it's also interesting because James the Apostle died in 44 AD, and this is mentioned in Acts. So obviously, the book of Acts is not averse to mentioning the death of the leaders of the church. Seems pretty fine with it. But it mentioned, so obviously the book of Acts was written after 44 AD, mentioning the death of James the Apostle. And yet James, the brother of Jesus, died, relatively shortly thereafter, just unmentioned. Again, seems to me the likely answer is it hadn't happened yet. And the book of Acts was written after 44 AD, before 62 AD, which would place it very, contemporaneously with Jesus' life. All the people are still alive, right? Again, something to think about. A couple more. Okay. One of Jesus' biggest prophecies, right, was the temple would be destroyed. This is like, a very, very bold prediction. The temple would be destroyed. Would be destroyed, and of course it was, right, in 70 AD. Right, and it was 70 AD. Again, no mention in the Bible, right? You think that would be a good one to mention, right? Hey, you guys remember when Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed? He was right. I guess he's God, right? That would be a good one to mention. Completely unremarked on. Again, I would say probably because it hadn't happened yet. So there's nothing for them to mention. Seems reasonable to me. Again, right? This is like a big thing, right? If your guy, your prophet gets something right, you probably want to talk about it, right? Again, if you read the sort of the Book of Mormon, and other writings of Joseph Smith, they love talking about the prophecies he got right. So you think they would have mentioned it. And finally, the book of Acts ends abruptly. And I would ask, what happened to Paul? Most of the book is about him. Right? What happened to him? What was his final fate? I don't know, right? Doesn't say. Maybe because it hadn't happened yet. Right? Otherwise, why would you just end it there? If there's more acts to talk about, if your main character is still out doing stuff, you probably would have written it down. They just decided that, it's long enough, end it. Probably not. Probably it hadn't happened yet, right? So, it's not an uncommon thing to say the Bible was written like way later, 200 and 300 AD. I really don't see how that makes any sense, right? It doesn't flow from what we know about the spread of Christianity. It doesn't comport with the historical events of the time. It doesn't follow the narrative about what the people did. It just in no way does it connect into it. And so I really think, when I say a few decades, I think that's when it was written. And I think it's the only thing that makes sense given kind of the content of the Bible and what they could have said, but just omitted. So before I erase that, any questions about that one? Okay. Back up here. Yeah. I don't know. What would the year have been? Well, I think pre-fire, I believe. So after 44 and before 64, would be my guess. I might have to look that one up too. If there is even a record, I'm not totally sure if they have it, but anyway. Okay. So, and this one's kind of related to number 3 here, but historians really like first-hand accounts. Right? So if someone says, I was there and I saw these things, and now let me tell you about them, the historians really like that. And of course, the time gap between when the events of Alexander the Great happened and when things were written, obviously is way too long for any first-hand accounts to exist, right? It's centuries. No one's living that long, so of course, no. Now, the Bible, I think, given what we just saw in the last one, is certainly well within the timeline. And we even see an example of Luke saying exactly this, basically, right? That he went around and interviewed people and got exactly their first-hand accounts. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe he could be lying, but I think we can say, like, there were first-hand accounts going on here. It fits the timeline. It fits the sort of structure of the narrative that's presented, and the characters literally saying exactly that. So I think we can probably conclude that one on that one. Another thing that historians like is sort of historical accuracy. So you may have seen some of these, what do they call them? Pseudepigraphal gospels, I think they call them, right? The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, these things, and obviously we don't consider them canon. And interestingly, some research has been done on them. And on things, for example, like the names of people in those stories were not names that anyone had used in that region at that time. Like those names didn't exist then. And so that's a good example of saying that does not comport with history. This obviously was written later because that name just didn't exist in that culture until the year 400, for example, right? So they've done things like that to even look at, the prevalence of names in this geographic region to see like if things match up. So I mean, I will say like, Alexander the Great, I mean, from what we know, like actually, that does actually, maybe that's why we believe it, right? We don't have any big problem. It's everything we seem to know about the history of the Greek Empire, it seems to line up. So we think that's pretty good. Now the Bible, does this comport with history? Actually, yes, and increasingly so. So, for example, people had a lot of doubts about Pontius Pilate for a long time. Okay. And then wouldn't you know it, they found coins with his name on them. They found inscriptions on stones with his name on them. And they realized like, oh yeah, maybe this guy did exist, right? But for a long time, scholars, like they thought that the Bible made him up. He never existed, okay? Until now we think that. And, I had mentioned, over time, our understanding of God, our arguments for God are strengthening via science and logic and mathematics and things, but also history, actually, and archaeology. As they discover more things, the Bible is constantly proven true. And my favorite example is the Hittite Empire. Okay, so you may remember this from the Old Testament. Okay, it talks about the Hittites, and they had a big empire. Okay, and they were, kind of a thorn in the side of the Israelites, et cetera, did all kinds of stuff. And for a long time, there was no historical evidence of them. And so again, historians and skeptics, they love to say like, well, obviously the Bible's wrong because it made up this empire. If this big empire really existed, we would have found evidence of them, right? You say there's a big empire, we have found nothing. Until in the 1960s, they did. They found a giant Hittite empire, sort of like southern Turkey. And they're like, whoops, it was here the whole time. And they found like massive ruins and all kinds of artifacts that they realized, oh, this is the Hittite Empire. And again, this is not even like a controversial thing. You can go look it up on Wikipedia or anything. Like it's all very well documented how no one believed it. Then finally they did in the 1960s, and they found all this evidence and all this stuff. And here's where they found it, and here's what they found. Right. So again, like, the stuff we're going over, this is not like some, kooky theories pulled in over. Like this is all very well established stuff. You can find in any kind of research you can go and do yourself if you want to know more. But I love that one because again, like for 2 millennia, people were using it as like, oh, the Bible doesn't know what it's talking about, Hittite Empire, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, kind of like with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're like, well, whoops, yeah, I guess it's right then. So another really, really good example. And then I think this is the last one I have here. Yeah. This is the number 6, the attestation of other sources. So this means like, do other works back up what it's saying? Other sources. And again, Alexander the Great, it's got some, right? Other people talk about things he did, mention them. And the Bible, actually, yes, as well. And I mentioned 2 of them already, right? Tacitus was a Roman historian. Josephus was a Jewish historian. And there's others as well. But these are the big ones. So, some people will say like, I mean, it's very uncommon these days, but they'll say, well, I don't even believe Jesus existed. I don't think he was even a person, right? Thankfully, this is not really a very serious belief these days, although there are still people that do still believe it. But you'd have to ask, like, well, then why are these Roman and Jewish historians talking about him, right? Again, they've got no skin in the game, as it were, right? No reason to lie. They don't believe in Jesus as the Son of God, but they still believed in him as a person enough to write about him and what his disciples did and the, sort of the events thereof. So yeah, we can find this, let's say attestation of extra biblical sources, other things aside from the Bible, agreeing again, not with like the claim that Jesus was the Son of God, but just like, yeah, Jesus was a person. This is where he lived. His disciples, followed him, and so on and so forth. So again, these are all 6 different criteria that historians use to analyze the reliability of ancient documents. And I think what we saw, I hope, is that the Bible is astronomically more reliable than any ancient document, right? Again, it's got the copies, it's got the textual accuracy, the time difference, the first-hand accounts, historical accuracy, attestation of other sources. It just boggles the mind of why it has all these things so much better than every other ancient document. Again, unless you believe in some divine, hand ordering the process, of course, right? Which we do. But there's no other way to explain it. Like, how do you explain why there's so many copies that are so accurate? It just doesn't make any sense. It's the only thing like it. And there's two other things I'll mention that these are not sort of criteria that historians use, but these are two that I really like. Okay, here, where are we?
What was the name of the pharaoh on the Moses time?
The Pharaoh and Moses? I don't know. I don't remember. Do you know it? I don't know.
I'm not sure, it might be Ramses.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
1, 2, 3, or 4.
Yeah, right.
One of them.
Yeah. Okay. So, what can we call this one? I'll put like non-historical, criteria. Kind of a weird title, but this is not criteria historians use. But actually, I personally like this even better, actually. So the first one is prophecy. Right? So obviously, the Bible has this unique feature in that it was written over like thousands of years, right? And this is very, very unusual for any book, but also all of these sort of books that are purporting to plug the hole in our reality, right? Most of them were written by one person over a very short period of time, right? Sort of Muhammad, Joseph Smith, Buddha, what have you, okay? And so, of course, there's not really time in that one person's life, typically, Joseph Smith aside, because apparently he did lots of wonders, apparently, but anyway. Usually there's not time for prophecy to be declared and then fulfilled, okay? But the Bible had this massive amount of time between when a lot of prophecies were made and when they were fulfilled. Now, some were short. Jesus obviously said that, temple will be destroyed, and then, of course, it was like 30, 40 years later. So that one is short, but all the ones about Jesus' birth and what he would do in his life and his death, right? These happened way, way before, right? Hundreds, thousands of years. And some people have calculated the chance that Jesus could fulfill all these prophecies. And it's not really a rigorous calculation, because I don't know how you could necessarily calculate it all, but the idea that Jesus would be able, one person, to fulfill all the prophecies is just like incalculably small, like just infinitesimally small, and would kind of require like a cabal of people, right? Because his parents obviously would have to have him born in the right place, and sort of tell him like what he had to do. Like, you can imagine it's like shadowy puppet kind of, in the background cabal over millennia orchestrating. Like, it's pretty unrealistic stuff, right? But otherwise, like, what would be the odds of one person, Jesus, being able to fulfill all the prophecies? Like, it really doesn't make any sense. So I believe it was C.S. Lewis who pointed this out as like the strongest reason for, or maybe it was, anyway, it was someone. That's not really important who said it, I guess. But the point is, the prophecies are really a unique feature of the Bible in that they span such a long period of time and allowed this very shocking sort of display of the truthfulness of it, right? Jesus' birth, life, and death obviously being the most prominent example, sort of all these things culminating in one person, right? In a very statistically improbable way. And, one interesting thing is, so Jesus said when he was in, Capernaum, he said, woe to you, people of Capernaum. If Sodom and Gomorrah had seen the miracles I've done here today, they would have repented, right? So it'll be worse for you on the day of judgment than for them, because you've seen it and you still reject me, right? So Jesus knew, right, that, and again, I think I've talked about this a bit. We call this like God's middle knowledge, or his knowledge of counterfactuals, right? Jesus said, if this would have happened, then this would have happened, right? So if I had gone to Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. So Jesus knows what would have happened if the situation was different, even though it didn't really happen, right? So God not only knows the past, the future, but all possible realities. Okay. So then the question could be, well, Jesus, if Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented if you had arrived, why didn't you then? Why didn't you go? And one possible answer could be that enough time had not yet elapsed for the prophecy to be significant, right? If we really wanted that weighty prophecy, right, the power that we can now look at it and be like, wow, it's really amazing that Jesus was able to fulfill all this prophecy. It would have been undercut a lot if, number one, a lot of prophecy hadn't even been made yet by, Genesis 15, 16, I don't know when Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. Pretty early on, though, okay? And also, any prophecies that were made had not been that much time had elapsed, right? So we wouldn't have the benefit of prophecy today. So maybe that's one reason, I don't know, but interesting to think about. However, to me, my favorite thing is the cohesion of the Bible. And again, we think about the Bible, it's very, very unique because, again, unlike, most, again, books in general, but also any sort of like quote unquote holy book, okay? It was not written by one person at one time. It was written by all kinds of people across all kinds of cultures, across a vast amount of time. So, what are the odds of Muhammad agreeing with himself when he wrote the Quran? Well, pretty good, I guess, right? All he has to do is like ask himself his opinion, and he couldn't write, he was illiterate, but he got someone to write it down, okay? Now, what are the odds that, King David, a king, okay, what are the odds that he would agree fundamentally with, say, the beaten and cast out prophet Jeremiah, with the exiles in Babylon, even with Abraham the patriarch, who was a very renowned person, but still lived a long time prior, okay, with the slaves of Egypt, or so maybe the ex-slaves when they came out, right? Like we're maybe starting to see like a socioeconomic picture here that's very, very different, right? Ruth coming from Moab, Esther, sort of this unintentional queen in a foreign land. Like these people are in very different situations. So why is the king agreeing with the pauper and the slave and the exile and the philosopher king and the warriors, right? This is very unusual. Usually these people have very different beliefs about how the world is ordered or should be ordered, what's important, what's not important, right? It doesn't really make sense that they would all agree about what is important, what's not important, the nature of God, the nature of life, right? That's really, really weird. Imagine we can gather, how many people wrote the Bible? I don't know, whatever, 30, 40. Get 30, 40 people anywhere on earth today and ask them to agree on something. Good luck, right? Imagine though, now you get 30, 40 people from across 2,000 years, get them to agree on what's important. No chance. And yet we have 30, 40 people writing the Bible, all basically agreeing on what's important, the nature of reality. They're all agreeing. Again, doesn't matter their socioeconomic status, doesn't matter their culture, right? Again, you've got these sort of like prehistory, nomadic, Abraham, the, slaves. You have this sort of lawless judge time, right? You've got the monarchy, the exile, the, under Roman occupation. Doesn't matter what the culture is. Somehow they're all still agreeing on what's important, right? So socioeconomic status doesn't matter. Culture doesn't matter. Language doesn't matter. They're all agreeing on what's important. This is insane that this could ever just happen, right? And as far I mentioned is talking to my brother-in-law over Christmas, and one criticism he gave of the Bible was it was written by all these different people across all these different times. It's like, yeah, that's the amazing part of it, right? That's what makes it really special, because nothing else is like that. Look at every other holy book. They're not like that, right? And this is what I think makes the Bible really unique and really powerful, because that defies human reason. How could you get, again, what shadowy cabal is manipulating events of all humanity? They were like, all right, okay, we got a big Abraham, I got this plan. For the next 2,000-3,000 years, we're going to orchestrate all human events, and we're going to make sure that all our descendants, however many, generations down the line, they're going to agree with us, and they're going to write this down, and we're all going to get this all organized for the next 3,000-4,000 years. Like that, there's no way, that just does not make sense. But otherwise, how can you make sense of the Bible, right? The only argument would be, well, again, I don't know, it was written in like the late 1800s, I guess. I don't know, and it's all made up. But again, we know that's not true. So I think we're coming up on 9 o'clock here. I guess the very last thing I'll just say is, like, people say that the Bible's old, and so it's culturally irrelevant, right? So again, they'll say, well, look, it's so obvious we know that homosexual relationships are fine. The Bible says they're not. Therefore, the Bible's outdated. It's culturally irrelevant. We can discard it. But what we've seen time and time again, right, is that truth does not have a temporal component, right? Truth is not bound by time. Something is true or it's not. And time does not make the Bible any more or less true than what it is, right? Truth doesn't change. Absolute truth doesn't change. Cultural norms change, laws change, opinions change. Truth doesn't change. So the Bible cannot be, its truthfulness cannot be undercut by time. A culture's appreciation of it, understanding of it, that can change, maybe, but the truthfulness cannot change. So I hope for all these reasons, we can see that the Bible is not only necessary if we want to understand reality, we need some, say, external divine source to tell us, right? Because how could we know, again, like morality, that it's not okay to steal, to murder, to do whatever? Well, I don't know. There's no way we could ever know that, because it's not written, get as strong in the microscope as you want. You're not going to see the morality inscribed upon an atom. It's not there. So where are you going to find it? You need someone from outside the system to tell you. So we need something, and the Bible seems pretty darn reliable in ways that other ones aren't. Well, like I say, it's about 9 o'clock, so I guess we can pray to finish this one up. So why don't we do that? Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, God, for this fourth class in this course and for everyone who could attend tonight. God, I just thank you that as we kind of go through the roadmap of this course and we kind of build from one to the next, that we just see that from whatever angle we look at this, God, it's just so amazing that we keep coming to understand the truthfulness of you, of your word, of our need for you, and also the power of sin that can really get in the way, God, when we think that we know what's true and right and good, and we call into question your nature, God. And so we just thank you for your truth that reveals reality to us, reveals what sin is to us, and then of course for your son Jesus, who saved us from that sin, God, did not leave us in it. So thank you for this class and everyone in it. We just pray for your truth to be revealed, and that it would strengthen our faith and also our witness to others. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you guys so much. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know now or later, or email me. And yeah, we will continue kind of looking at the Bible next class. You're very, very welcome.